Welcome to Retroware TV. I'm Ito.
And I'm John D.
And thank you for tuning in.
Well, first off, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we are. Retroware TV is a classic gaming television show made specifically for the internet. We will go back and take a look at classic games and see where video games got their start and how we got to where we are today in the world of video games.
Our first look is at a classic game that really doesn't need any introduction. It's Double Dragon for the arcade. However, we're going to talk about the port made for the GBA, Double Dragon Advance. Here's a look.
Double Dragon was the definitive beat-em-up in the arcades. It featured solid gameplay, creative characters, and many challenges. Tons of ports of the game were made for various platforms. Probably the most successful was the NES version, which unfortunately didn't incorporate the two-player co-op mode of the arcade. This loss, however, was semi-balanced out with new game modes, and an achievement system which would enable you to do new moves not present in its arcade counterpart. The Sega Master System version did have the co-op mode. However, the game controls were a little wonky. It did have level designs more authentic to its arcade counterpart, but in my opinion, it doesn't hold a stick to the NES version. Though there are multiple other ports, the Atari 2600 version is probably the most surprising. It's hard as hell. You would never recognize this as Double Dragon if it wasn't for this theme music. Some 16 years later, we would be given one of the best ports of this game. Distributed by Atlas and created by Million in November of 2003, Double Dragon Advance is a remake of the famous Double Dragon arcade game. I love this tune. However, my favorite version of it is probably the NES one. In the start of the game, you're going to want to listen to the beginning music. It leads to a pretty cool update. Cutscenes. These cutscenes provide a storyline to the brawling mayhem that is Double Dragon. Prior to these cutscenes, you really didn't know why the thugs in the beginning of the arcade game decided to take your girlfriend. They just walk up to your woman, punch her in the stomach, and take her away, all while showing her panties. These new cutscenes tell us that the Shadow Warriors kidnapped your girlfriend to obtain the book Saosetsu Ken, which apparently you have. There are tons of new modes of play in this game. You have your standard one-player game, a new mode called One-Player Double Dragon game, where you get to control both Billy and Jimmy Lee by swapping back and forth. The only bad thing about this is you only control one character. The other just stands there vulnerable to getting the crap beat out of him. You also have a two-player co-op mode available via Link Play. This is probably the best way to play the game. However, you do need two GBAs, the link cable, and two Double Dragon Advance games. There's also survival mode, where you try to beat as many enemies as you can until your health runs out. The graphics in the game are pretty solid. The backgrounds remain true to the original, with only a few differences here and there. Also, the cast of characters have been done with a more modern look. Probably one of the best updated character looks is the main man himself, Adobo. I mean, look at him. They gave him a freaking afro. How cool is that? Nah, there's plenty of bald ones still. He also looks a lot more lean than his NES counterparts. I mean, those guys are huge. Adobo is probably one of the scariest SOBs in all video game history. Nobody with Adobo. All these years later, he still scares the out of me. Tons of new animations have been added, and even new characters and stages. The sound of the game also shines. Music from the original game has been remixed, and sounds great. They even added more remixed tunes from the tracks that didn't appear until later sequels. The sound effects are pretty standard, but they do the job beautifully. Now for the most important part of the game, gameplay. Everything that made the original game great is here. The punches, the kicks, the whips. Yeah. This has made me feel uncomfortable ever since I was 7. It just doesn't seem right. I guess it's okay, since technically you do whip other people too.
Now whip it into shape it up, get straight.
Speaking of weapons, there are also new ones, such as the ball and chain and the nunchucks. There's even these sticks. I don't even know what they're called. I'm no kung fu artist. There are also several new moves that Billy and Jimmy Lee can do. You have the hyper uppercut, the hyper knee, the cyclone kick, which wasn't even available till Double Dragon 2, blocking, and a few more. The controls themselves are pretty solid. There's no slowdown, something that plagued the original arcade version, and the movement is very fluid. Moves are pretty easy to achieve, and they're at your disposal right from the beginning. The game's difficulty is a little on the easier side, even when played on medium. Hard seems more like a standard difficulty. The original arcade game was a little bit more difficult, especially since you didn't have these new moves that are featured in the GBA version. All in all, Double Dragon Advance is a solid game from start to finish. It's a must-own for any Double Dragon fan, or even any beat-em-up fan. It's highly recommended.
I really have to say the Double Dragon Advance game is probably one of my favorite versions of Double Dragon. It's a great port. It's very clean. The graphics look great, and I can't recommend it enough.
Well, I mean, most people, like yourself, I'm sure, we were always big fans of the NES version, considering that was the game that, I mean, we were first introduced to Double Dragon, but I remember back when I was in 3rd grade, I had that one friend who had the Sega Master System, and we always thought that was really cool, mostly because in my mind there was only the Atari 5200 and the Nintendo when I was 8 years old. Mm-hmm. And the Sega Master System version is actually pretty cool. I always kind of liked it. I have a soft spot for it. The sprites are very similar to the Nintendo version, and the 2-player cooperative mode is very nice.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest bonus for me. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a bad version. I do like it. I actually own it. But my biggest complaint is the controls are a little loose and not really as solid as I'd like them to be. And the sprites occasionally, you get slowed down and the sprites just like disappear randomly.
Yeah, the technical presentation definitely lacks a little bit. But yeah, all in all, Double Dragon is such a great franchise.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something I really hope that they fairly soon revive. I mean, there hasn't been a Double Dragon game for years now.
That's true.
I mean, we have the port, it was released in 2003, but it's a remake, so it doesn't really count.
Yeah.